Hi, everybody. As I look back on my childhood, I have to admit that I think it was actually pretty idyllic. In fact, it kind of looked a lot like a Leave It to Beaver environment. And I'm actually pretty proud of that, and I feel pretty fortunate to have had that kind of a background. I'm now, fast-forwarded, the mother of 3 kids, all in their 20s, and I have spent a lot of time trying to recreate the lessons and the balance and generosity and sensibilities that I received as lessons from my parents, who loved each other and us very, very much. I'm a lucky person. It hasn't been easy, though, because in today's culture, we've got some interesting challenges. Our kids have grown up in an environment of constant connectivity, instant gratification, and the pressure to be cool is as intense, or maybe more so, than it's ever been. And even if you look around the cultural context that we all live in, there have been some pretty big changes. So whereas my kids maybe watched The Cosby Show or Family Ties, which, while not exactly Leave It to Beaver, weren't too far away, kids today are actually watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or worse yet, Jersey Shore. And I don't know about you, but that gives me a small feeling of alarm that this is the environment in which our kids are experiencing culture. So I think about those kind of crazy families with wild excess and bizarre behaviors, and they're people who have theoretically made it in our culture. But even if you look at how average families are represented on TV, you have to give a little bit of pause. On the channel TLC, which, by the way, is the Learning Channel, folks, there's a show called Say Yes to the Dress. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's actually an interesting show about prospective brides, and they drag along mom and sisters and friends, and they go off to a posh New York bridal salon to choose the dress of their dreams for their wedding. Now, my daughter's 24 years old, and that doesn't seem very far-fetched to me. And I know the excitement that you can get caught up in wanting the absolute best for your kids on every level, including a say yes to the dress environment. It's pretty tempting. But unfortunately, this kind of dream is often out of reach of most average families today, because while some of those dresses are $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000, some of them are more than $20,000, which is actually a down payment on a house. And when families can't afford not just a dress, but they can't afford the other basics that many of us take for granted, those dreams become nightmares for many of them. And our fragile economy becomes even more broken in their eyes. We have a model at Bright Peak Financial that we call Living in Balance. And because I actually love models, having been in financial services for a long time, I think this is the best kind of pie chart there is. I don't know about you, but I really like this kind. It seems to be the season for it. I'm particularly fond of the blueberry, which is why it's the smallest one. This model is important because it's actually a model we use all the time as a very simplified way for people to grab onto their budget, because the complexity of budgeting is beyond either the interest or sometimes the ability of a lot of young families, because they're very time-starved. So what we teach them is 50-30-20. 50% for your needs, housing, transportation, food, childcare. 30% for your wants, celebrations, vacations, and 20% for savings, retirement, emergency savings, and college. 50-30-20. It's actually pretty straightforward. Now I want to introduce you to a family that we know, and we know it well because we actually made them up. Mike and Jessica are made up. They're made up out of the national statistics for middle-class families. They happen to be a younger middle-class family, but they use the median statistics for virtually everything in their life because that's how we created it. So they actually have 2 kids, ages 5 and 2. Mike's in his early 30s and Jessica's 29, and they make a little over $70,000 a year, which is pretty close to the national median. And that sounds great, $70,000. They're not rolling in dough, but they're probably doing okay. And I want you to take a look at Mike and Jessica's pie. And it looks just a little bit different. Because with Mike and Jessica, if you use the national statistics for how much people spend on housing and transportation and childcare and food and those essentials, virtually 90% of that 70,000 is used up on needs, leaving very little left over for wants and savings. And if you look at this slide closely, it's not just that I'm bad at math, it doesn't add up to 100%. And the reason is because every single month, whether it's a surprise in their budget or whether it's not being able to resist temptation that they see in the culture of consumerism around us, they dip a little further into savings, if there is any, and when the savings is gone, it becomes debt. And pretty soon, this is a family in crisis. Now, it's not a big deal, I guess, if just one family's in crisis, though I'd like to think we all would feel bad about that. But if you think about Mike and Jessica and realize that they are simply representative of young middle-class families, and you multiply that by a neighborhood or a city or a state or a country, there's not just a crisis brewing in the middle class, it's actually bubbling over on the stove, and it's burning. And that's a real problem, and that's something that we all need to care about. But if I were sitting in your shoes, I might actually say, yeah, I feel kind of bad about that, but so what? Why should I care as much as you seem to up there on the stage? The reason is because the middle class is actually the backbone of our country and our economy. And if the middle class doesn't work, it doesn't bode well for all of the rest of the things that we need to work in our society. That middle class is really important. Now, we have kind of a schizophrenic relationship with money in our country, so how many of you have been driving home from work and you hear on the radio, consumer spending is up? It's like, yeah, okay, wait, consumer spending is up, that means people are spending more money, that means that employers probably going to hire more, companies are going to do better, the stock market's going to go up, and maybe my 401k will even look a little bit better. Awesome. But unfortunately, that scenario comes fully equipped with $2.5 trillion in consumer debt because every Mike and Jessica family out there is actually using that extra debt often to do that spending. And they're spilling over 100% of their budget every month. And that's a pretty big challenge. So then a lot of people that I talk to say, well, it's not a big deal because we're just going to educate people better and we're going to encourage them to, do better and get higher paying jobs. And as employers do better, salaries will go up. And that'll be great, and maybe even a few more bonuses. And I think those are great things, by the way. I'd love to see people get better jobs, and I'd love to have employers feel that they're doing well enough that they can share with employees. But unfortunately, some research that we've done recently at Bright Peak would lead us to believe that's probably not going to work as well as we would all like. And the reason is because income is actually not correlated with financial security, or financial security then with generosity. So if you look at this chart, you can look at whether people make $50,000 a year or $250,000 a year. Unfortunately, it is not connected to their sense of financial security or their ability to be generous. And that generosity, by the way, is the juice that makes City 2.0 possible. Instead, what's fascinating is that people's perceived financial situation, meaning whether they believe they're secure and stable financially, is the driver regardless of income level. That's the key. Now, how about Mike and Jessica? How do we think they're feeling? Well, I'd submit that they're not feeling like they are stable or secure and able to be generous in our communities. Instead, they're actually afraid. And people who are afraid are not generous, and they're not going to be the ones to raise their hand to volunteer to coach soccer, or to give blood, or to carry extra food to the food shelves, or all of the things that those of us who care about schools and churches and not-for-profits and neighborhoods depend on every single day for that generosity juice in our culture. So that's a pretty big problem, and unfortunately, it seems to be getting bigger. So what do we do about it? Well, I'm an optimist at heart, and I believe there are both macro and micro solutions available, but since our country seems completely unable to have civil conversations about macro things, I'm going to leave that for another day. And instead, what I'm going to do is talk about the micro steps that you and I could take this afternoon as we walk out of here to make a difference in not only our own families, but in those around us. And it's really 3 very simple things. The first one is to walk it, and the second one is to talk it, and the third one is to give it. Let me start with walk it. Most of us believe strongly that we'd like to set good examples for people. But I'd like all of you to think a little bit about, and I won't ask for a show of hands, but how many of your personal financial situations look like they're in balance, the 50, 30, 20, and how much of them trend a little bit more towards Mike and Jessica's, the 90, 10 plus? Because if you can't find ways to actually balance your financial situation, how do we expect other families to do that? We've simply got to find ways where we are also digging deep and making sure that our spending and our values are starting to line up. And at least as important, that we start to separate our needs and our wants. Because that's what the Kardashians have taught us. They've taught us that our wants bleed over into our needs every day, and it destroys and blows up family budgets all the time. So is that 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house really a need? Or maybe is it actually more of a want? And how about the premium channels on cable? How about some of the other things that each one of us occasionally choose to spend money on? Those are great things, by the way. I don't think any of us don't want those things in our culture. The question is, can we afford them? And if we act like we can afford them when we really can't, what is it that we're teaching everybody else? We have to start walking it and asking ourselves whether or not we think that our lives are living in balance so that we can too operate from a foundation of generosity and security. If we walk it, we're going to role model that for others. The second thing is equally important, though, which is talk it. And the reason that that's so important is because money is a taboo subject in our country today. We don't talk about money. Having done a bunch of research, we find people in our focus groups much more willing to talk about their sex lives than their money. I don't know what that says, but I'm a little alarmed. If they don't talk about money, and we're not talking to our kids or our neighbors or our colleagues about money at work, then where are people learning about money? They might be learning about it from Jersey Shore. That's a little bit concerning. We have to start articulating what our beliefs and our values and what is important to us about money every day. It shouldn't just be asked for, it should be expected that these conversations are going on all the time. Money is a critical part of our society. It's a critical part of family health. We need to make sure that we are having those conversations. Now, interestingly, there's some stuff going on with Gen Y that's kind of exciting because they're not only starting to talk about money, but they're talking about it in some new ways, and they're doing some new behaviors that maybe those of us who are baby boomers, which, by the way, is one of the worst in terms of savings and financial behavior, we may be able to learn from. Because instead of actually buying that second car, a lot of Gen Y kids are actually signing up for Zipcar, and they only use that second car when they need it at much lower expense. Or instead of deciding that they absolutely have to have the new snowblower, they realize that if their neighbors can actually all do it together using neighborrow.com, that maybe they can collectively reduce that budget item in their personal financial situations. Or forego the new dining room table set and instead maybe get the used one off of Craigslist, which is a ubiquitous solution for lots of Gen Y and Gen X and baby boom solutions. Those little things in and of themselves won't, of course, solve the problem, but they're meaningful steps to begin to move all of us to talk about money, share the information, and make sure that we're putting our values and our money and our behaviors lined up together, which unfortunately isn't happening very often. The other thing that's worrisome about these young families in particular is that when you don't have any savings to fall back on, you are so vulnerable. The 5 biggest risks facing these young families are, number 1, job loss. 1 in 2 of us will lose a job at some point in our career. Number 2 is disability, believe it or not. And what's That doesn't always come equipped with a wheelchair, but sometimes it does come equipped with a bed rest for pregnancy where no paycheck is coming in for a long time, or a car accident that throws somebody out of work. Those are the kinds of disabilities that happen much more often than people get them credit for, usually unprotected. Premature death is probably obvious, and lack or insufficient health insurance, or waiting way, way too late to save for retirement until it's too late to catch up. Now, it's one thing for a family that is actually living in balance to cope with those things. They're resilient. They have the economic wherewithal to withstand some of those things that happen in their life. But if you're Mike and Jessica, not so much. Very difficult to withstand the ups and downs that all of us run those risks in families all the time. We should be talking about emergency savings at the dining room table. We should be making sure that work colleagues are reminded to maximize their retirement savings and take advantage of any match that's there. Those are the little acts of talking about it that start to change, literally, the conversation. And the third one is give it. We have to demonstrate that we are generous, active, engaged members of our communities. It's critically important because it is the juice that makes it work. And if any of you is involved with a church or a school or a not-for-profit or a neighborhood, you've got to make sure that we are getting middle-class families resilient and that we're demonstrating that we too want to give it in time and money. And for middle-class families, it's the simple acts of generosity that we may actually discard that are sometimes the most important. It's paying your sister's cell phone bill while she's out of work, or making sure you drive the neighbor to their doctor's appointment when their car is in the shop, or donating blood when you have the opportunity, or being the one to reluctantly raise your hand when they need the assistant soccer coach. Those are the things that make our communities work, not just today, but in City 2.0. Now, I hope that I've taught my kids those lessons, but I will tell you that the acid test is still coming when my 24-year-old daughter shows up and says she too is getting married. I want her to have a great wedding and a great wedding dress, but are we going to say yes to an excessive dress that's outside our spending, or are we going to say no to that and instead make good balanced choices, not just on her wedding, but with those lessons to make sure that she learns them for herself and her kids and her kids' kids? I think that's one of the keys to City 2.0. Thank you very much.